Okay, welcome. This is Random Thoughts from County Antrim, my podcast. I am David McDonnell. This is my half hour of yarns, stories, random tidbits of historical nature, and just random thoughts that come out of my wee brain. Today, July 5th, 2020, I'm going to do something a little different, and that is I'm going to tell you a fable. Now, before I get into the fable, I just wanted to tell you one of the significant events that happened to me this week. And that is I got tested for coronavirus. Now, I finally reached the criteria where I was eligible for a test. And it wasn't any particular health problems. I think I just fit a general criteria, and it was called Project Baseline. I think they were just trying to look for people who fit a various criteria so they could test and see how they were doing under the pandemic conditions. So I went through the test. It was done at a local pharmacy, a chain pharmacy, a fairly large one. And they had a drive-through window where ordinarily they'd slide your prescription drugs through the little tray, and you could pick it up without ever leaving your car. But that's where I got the test, where I went through the line. They put in the tray, after they checked my code number and my identification, they put in there a basket with a vial and also a sealed container of a swab. And the tech who was still in the store told me to open up the container with the swab, stick it in my right nostril and move it around a bit, and then keep it there for 15 seconds. And then take it out and put it in the other nostril, swirl it around a bit, keep it there for 15 seconds. And when I was done, he told me to take it out of my nostril, put it in the vial, seal the vial, put it back in the basket, and slide it back through the tray to him, who was still waiting inside. Now, this was Saturday, a week ago. And for a week, I didn't hear anything at all from the testing folks until I got an email yesterday. And the email told me, again, after I verified my code and my ID, and as secure as you can get through the internet, I was able to open up a link which told me I did not have the virus. Now, of course, it really didn't say that I did not have the virus, because I could have had the virus yesterday, and I could have the virus today. What the email told me was I did not have the virus a week ago when I got tested. So it's somewhat reassuring. I mean, I guess better than the alternative, but I'm not one of those that are counted in the several million Americans who have tested positive and the millions more around the world who've been tested positive. So I'll take it as good news. Now, this whole testing process, though, got me to thinking, and the thinking got me to a story. And I worked through the mechanics of a story, trying to figure out how do I tell this whole testing process. And I came up with an outline of a story, which, as I put it together, it kind of evolved into a fable. Now, you may ask yourself, or ask me, what's the difference between a story and a fable? And the answer is, I don't know. There isn't much of a difference, but people tend to recognize one versus the other. And I think there is a distinction, but it's not a distinction I totally understand. And if I did understand, I probably could not explain it to you. So I'm not positive if this is a story or a fable, but here it is. Now, there was an ancient kingdom in Ireland, and it was a prosperous kingdom. They had fine land, great for growing crops and raising cattle. And there was a huge river running through the kingdom, and it fostered trade throughout the kingdom, and even some trade outside of the kingdom. And ancient Druids established learning centers inside the kingdom. And it was not only to foster religion, but it fostered other things like medicine, ancient medicine, and astrology, which kind of evolved into astronomy. And when St. Patrick came to the island, he put a monastery within the kingdom. And that, too, tended to foster education and training and learning within the kingdom. There were also Brian law centers, learning centers within the kingdom where people could learn Brian law and the traditions, the legal traditions of Ireland. And we even had a strong program or educational centers for bards in Shanachie, the tellers of tales and folklore, to preserve the history and the folklore of the kingdom. Now, it also had, and this is very important, it also had a very, very strong and formidable warrior class. Now, this is extremely important in the ancient world because whatever you had, without a strong warrior class, whatever you had was subject to being taken by someone else. And the warriors had a very important job, and it was one they took very, very seriously. And that is to protect the people from outside invaders who would, from time to time, come into the kingdom and covet possessions that they saw and then take them. And this happened quite often in the ancient world. And the warriors also kept peace within the kingdom. And for those who violated the traditions and the Brian laws, and those who committed crimes against their neighbors, faced the wrath of their warriors. So that's why the role of the warriors was so important in ancient Ireland, but also particularly this kingdom. Now, this kingdom was led by a succession of kings, and for many centuries the king was chosen among one of the clan chiefs within the kingdom. And the chosen king was the one person above all others in which the clan chiefs could agree upon, who was best to lead the kingdom. And by lead the kingdom, I mean protect the people from these outside invaders and keep the peace within the kingdom. For it was only providing peace within the kingdom and protection from the outsiders that the people within the kingdom could be left alone and raise their families and ply their trade and live the kind of life in which they all wanted to live. Now, some of these kings, of course, were better than others, but by and large, they all had the same understood value and structure, which was meant that they took their role and their responsibility seriously. Now, our story takes place when one of these kings had died, and the clan chiefs assembled to choose a successor. And there were many capable chiefs, among which a new king would be chosen. But one king, or one candidate, I should say, one clan chief, was gaining much popularity with the people within this kingdom. And his name was Donel, and he was from the Mámh clan. And this was not a particularly powerful clan, but Donel had spent a great deal of time traveling throughout the kingdom, both during the months preceding the king's death and the several weeks thereafter. And he spoke to people at festivals and feasts, at banquet halls, at bonfires. And he reminded them how great the kingdom was and how great the kingdom could be. And he spoke about the dire threats from outside to the kingdom. And he suggested that he, and perhaps only he, could protect the kingdom from these outside threats and preserve the greatness of this kingdom. Now, when the clan chiefs met to choose a successor, they thought about Donel and about the powerful impact he had on the people. And so they decided to make Donel their king. So for several years after that, it appeared that they made a wise choice, at least to some, because the kingdom continued to prosper. And for a time, there were no serious threats within the kingdom. But a new threat did emerge. A strange people from across the sea entered the kingdom. And they were different from the Celts within the kingdom. They spoke a different language. Their hair was different. Their skin was a little lighter and their hair lighter. They wore different kind of clothes. And they looked to different gods. And worst of all, they were ferocious. Now, when they arrived at a coastal village, these strangers took everything they saw. They took the harvested crops. They took cattle. They took tools. They even took people. Men, women, and children were taken with them when they left the village. And then they burned everything in the village and sailed home, wherever that was. Now, there were a few warriors in the kingdom who were in the village at the time, but they were vastly outnumbered. And they were soon killed. They could not stop these invaders. Now, who were these invaders? No one knew at the time, but they eventually learned. They were the Vikings. Now, the Vikings had such an easy time raiding this village that they soon returned. And they sailed upriver into the kingdom. They found new villages. And they did the same things that they did to the first village. They took everything movable, including villagers, and they burned villages and sailed home. And again, the few warriors inside the town could not stop them. And word soon spread around the Viking world about how easy it was to come into this kingdom and do whatever it is that a Viking would want to do. And so more Vikings came, again and again, month after month. The Vikings even established a settlement at the edge of on the coastal area of the kingdom, so they would not have to sail home after they plundered and raided inside the kingdom. Now, word spread within the kingdom as well. News about the Vikings, and it was terrifying. And the people clamored for help and for protection. Now, the warriors throughout the kingdom gathered to create an army capable of stopping these Viking invaders. And these warriors beseeched the king. Please, they said, assemble an army and lead an army so that we may stop these Vikings. But King Donel did not. And he became very, very angry. And he was not so much angry at the Vikings for invading his kingdom. Rather, he was angry that the kingdom became transfixed with the Vikings. The people were no longer talking about how prosperous it was under the leadership of King Donel. Instead, they were talking about the dangers they were all in because of the Vikings. Now, King Donel was also afraid, and again, he was not so much afraid of the Vikings, but he was afraid that he was losing the adulation of the people, which is what he craved. And the Vikings, he thought, were becoming a distraction to this prosperity. And Donel was afraid that he would be blamed. Why, he thought, should he be blamed for the Vikings? Now, miraculously, the Vikings stopped coming for a while, and there were those including King Donel, who thought the danger had passed. But the Vikings returned. There was another Viking raid, and then another, and then another. And the news came to the king. 1 raid, 2 raids, 3 raids. And the number of raids continued to go up, and panic returned to the kingdom. Now the clan chiefs and the warriors again gathered before King Donel, begging for resolution. Each of them saw the problem as the Vikings encroaching on more and more land within the kingdom, with the number of raids mounting. King Donel, on the other hand, saw the problem a little differently. The problem, he thought, was not that the Vikings were raiding within his kingdom. The problem was the number of raids. And he thought if everyone would simply stop counting the number of raids, then there would be no Viking raids. The number of Viking raids would be 0. And who could panic in the face of 0 Viking raids? And who would not be proud of King Donel for eliminating the Viking raids? And the more they thought about it, the clan chiefs and the warriors realized they could not argue with this simple logic. And they were in awe that King Donel had such wisdom. So word traveled around the kingdom that the Viking raids ceased. And Donel was applauded for coming up with the solution to this serious problem of Viking raids. It was a miracle that King Donel had bestowed upon the people. And King Donel enjoyed the adulation that he so much craved and believed that he deserved, for it was he and he alone which ended the Irish risk of Viking raids. So the people went about their daily business as they did before the Viking raids, and everyone was happy for life being so prosperous. Or at least it was for those who did not live in villages that were raided by the Vikings. For you see, the Vikings did not leave. They never left. They continued to raid. They settled further inland in the kingdom with more and more settlements. And there was indeed little reason for the Vikings to leave. It was, in fact, wonderful land with fine land for grazing of cattle and raising crops. It was a fine place for the Vikings to raise their families. It was a place for the Vikings to prosper. And so the kingdom began to shrink in size. This was slow at first, but it became more pronounced. And the area within the control of the Vikings began to grow and continued to grow until the Viking settlements and the area of Viking control included the entire kingdom. And all the while, King Donel would tell all who would listen that there were no Viking raids. Because, after all, who was left to count them? Now that is the tale. That is the fable. Now there is, of course, a moral. That's one of the things typical of a fable. There's a moral to every fable. And since we're all used to telling fables to children, it's part of children's stories, Aesop's fables, the Uncle Remus tales, the storyteller always tells us at the end the moral of the story. Now, the moral of this story should be obvious, and I will not state the obvious. If you did not get the moral, then there's not much explaining I could do. If you do not understand the moral, then you probably are one of the people who would not be counting the Viking invasions. So that's the end of my podcast today. I hope you enjoyed this fable. Please take a look at my website, clandonel.net. Send me an email if you have any questions or if you want to argue with me about what is a fable. My email is clandonel@gmail.com. And I have a Facebook page at, just go to Clandonel on the search menu of Facebook and communicate with me that way. As a news update, my last live festival that had been scheduled for this year has been canceled. So I'm officially not going to any Irish festivals this year. At least not live. I got invited to a Irish festival first weekend of August. Wonderful festival. It's the Dublin Irish Festival in Dublin, Ohio. And I will participate in the festival virtually. They're putting together a program with some recordings of prior performers, different videos that people are submitting, and collectively they'll put together a virtual Irish festival. And I'm very, very excited to be a part of that. So that's it for today. Please join us again next week. In the meantime, be safe, be careful, do the right thing, and goodbye. Shalom.